This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Xcast. As ever, the truth is in here. I'm your host today, Carl Sweeney, and thank you for joining me for another episode. And what we're going to do today, what we thought is that because we've just covered Triangle on the podcast, Kurt North and Paige Schechter have talked about Chris Carter's directorial extravaganza. What we thought is we'd follow up that discussion, try and tease out some of the connections between that episode and the work of Alfred Hitchcock, and actually more generally, connections between the X-Files and Alfred Hitchcock. And joining me on this episode is Marlene Stemme. Hey, Marlene.
Hey, Carl.
How are you doing, Marlene? How's it going?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay, thank you. I'm not doing too bad at all. And I'm looking forward to this because I know that both you and I would say fans of Alfred Hitchcock. That's fair to say, isn't it?
It is. Yes, and we've talked a little bit about these connections before, but not in a formal way, so this will be exciting.
Yeah, hopefully. I think this will allow us to get into some areas that we may not have traversed on the podcast previously. So I guess the place to start then is with Hitchcock himself. So let's maybe assume that there'll be people listening who have a range of prior knowledge about Alfred Hitchcock. I'm sure some people will be very familiar, some somewhat less so, and maybe some people who have never even seen a Hitchcock film. Who knows? So, Marlene, why do you think, who is Alfred Hitchcock, as you understand it, and why do you think he's such a significant figure?
Well, I think he's a significant figure just in film. I know he was never recognized as critically in his day as he was popularly, and as, recognized as critically then as he is now, which I think is really an interesting connection with the X-Files too, because I think that he was trying to entertain an audience, and tell a good story and not just make an acclaimed sort of movie, I guess, if that's a fair assessment. I think his work is artistic, but I think it's because it is popular. I think that it in that time wasn't regarded as being maybe as creative or as significant as we see it as being, now. I mean, you would probably be more able to answer that from a historical angle. But I think just in the history of cinema, the way that he, tells a story and the way that he uses characters to, there's characterization of them as individuals, but they also have these kind of thematic character types, I would say, like the wrongly accused man or a certain dynamic from the past that comes back, and then just, of course, like his use of suspense, which is, I think, the big thing. And then how he just can kind of like draw out the suspense and really pull the audience into the character's plight. So I think that it lends itself well to, all sorts of storytelling. And then I think as well, there are just images that are indelible from his movies that are, again, they kind of straddle that line between the artistic and the popular, but I think that keeps them really memorable for a long time.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money, because I think that Hitchcock, I'd say, is commonly regarded as one of the greatest filmmakers of all time now. And I think what's interesting is exactly what you point to, the fact that he kind of straddles that kind of high art, low art divide. So it's interesting to kind of map the development of that, because like you say, a popular entertainer, but it took a while until opinion kind of solidified that he was much more than that. So yeah, things like the fact that he didn't win an Oscar in competition, had a few nominations. And then I've got a book on Hitchcock. It's called Hitchcock's Films by Robin Wood, which was from 1965 originally. And the opening sentence is, why should we take Hitchcock seriously? And it spends quite a lot of time addressing that question. And I think it's in line with a broader tendency, really. I think cinema often at that time and before kind of treated as maybe like a down-at-heel cousin of something like theatre or literature. So I think the interesting thing now is that here we are, and I think the pendulum has well and truly swung. I think what happened, just quickly, is I think that there are a group of French critics in the 50s, people like Francois Truffaut, who championed this idea of the auteur, these directors who exhibited a personal signature across a range of films, and Hitchcock was one of the figures they latched onto. So the sort of key signatures kind of that you allude to, so the falsely accused man on the run, or stories about guilty women, stories about murder, stories about espionage, and things that people can point to in that sense that recur. But even into the 60s, you had critics like Andrew Saris in the States who started to take Hitchcock seriously, but got some pushback for it. But I think if we fast forward from there to the present day, and now his position's well and truly solidified, So there's a film magazine in Britain, Sight and Sound. Every 10 years, they do a greatest film of all time poll. And for decades, Citizen Kane was number one. And in the most recent poll was 2012, and Vertigo took the top spot.
Huh.
And I think also Psycho, North by Northwest, and Rear Window also in that top 100 poll. Mm-hmm. They also ran a director's poll simultaneous alongside the critics poll, and North by Northwest, Psycho, and Vertigo also made the top 100 in there too. Vertigo was number 7. So, yeah, I think just if I had to boil it into a sentence, I think that Hitchcock's films endure because, as you say, not only do they continue to entertain, but they're richly artistic too, and they can sort of withstand the weight of, dedicated analysis. Mm-hmm. So I suppose a question to follow up then would be, why would people on the X-Files be drawn to referencing somebody like Hitchcock through an episode like Triangle, or some of the others we're going to come on to discuss? Why do you think there's that incentive there for people like Chris Carter to draw on Hitchcock's work?
Oh gosh. Well, I think one other thing about Hitchcock is that he takes the audience into consideration. And I don't mean like catering to an audience, but their reactions, it's sort of something that would maybe seem beneath the work of, someone that was sort of pure artist, I guess, working at that time, to consider kind of like the common person and how they would respond to something. So I think that lends itself well. And again, like the sense of like emotion that's going to come from the audience, I guess is what I mean. And I think that that's something that lends itself well to a TV show, especially one like The X-Files. And I think The X-Files also is very visual. So a lot of those little illusions that we're going to talk about fit well within that framework. And I know we're going to talk more about the suspense aspect in a while, but I think that trying to kind of pull some of that, Hitchcock's sort of flavor of how he did suspense into the show, I could see that connection. I mean, I think a lot of the X-Files writers, especially in the earlier years, pulled a lot from movies, we've talked a little bit about that before on the podcast. So I think that Hitchcock in that way is just kind of a natural, and there's some things that Hitchcock has done that they've incorporated into the show, especially I think of like Glenn Morgan and James Wong, that are just either elements that you can appreciate and that give, a little bit more flavor to the episode if you know that they come from Hitchcock. But if they don't, or if you don't know that, then the episode still stands on its own. I think there are a few where it sort of falls apart if you don't get the reference. But I think for the most part, it just adds another layer to the episodes. And I think that that's something that the best X-Files do really well, is kind of like layer on those levels of meaning. And I just also like like what you talked about with the sort of straddling that divide between something that's a little more artistic and creative and that stretches an audience, and then something that's just kind of popular and entertaining.
I think that's exactly right. I think that, as you point out, with people like Glenn Morgan and James Wong, a lot of these writers were quite cine-literate. Even you can extend that to people like Chris Carter, who would often talk about his televisual influences like Kolchak, but he would also refer to things like Raiders of the Lost Ark, wouldn't he, when discussing particular references. And as you say, it's quite an obvious reference point to tap into Hitchcock's work if you're working on something that, like The X-Files, is trying to be quite thought-provoking, whilst also being entertaining for a mass audience, and often trying to be, exciting, suspenseful, to generate some fear. Yeah. And there's quite a rich tradition of people of doing that, of drawing on Hitchcock. So people like Brian De Palma with films like Dressed to Kill, or Spielberg with some of his early films like Duel or Jaws, or David Lynch, perhaps, with a couple of his films. So, and many more besides. And I think a lot of that, I think there are several reasons for it, but I think a lot of it can be attributed to two films in particular of Hitchcock's, which are films we'll refer to again as we continue to talk. But Psycho and The Birds, because I think that they're two of the touchstones of modern horror, in the sense that I think of Psycho, because of the way it generated that horror, that it came from the human psyche, and it served as this prototype for all manner of, serial killer films, slasher films, and so on. And then The Birds, because its theme was kind of people versus nature, order versus chaos. And I think that also became a key through line in the horror genre. So I think these films, and some others too, I think they're an underpinning influence in a lot of films and TV series, even where it's not explicitly intended always. But I think let's start, or maybe we could talk about some occasions in the X-Files where there is an explicit connection. And I think maybe the most obvious one is Triangle, which has just been covered on the podcast, which we haven't heard what Kurt and Paige had to say yet, I don't think. So it'll be interesting. They may well have discussed the rope connection to some extent on the podcast itself. But yeah, Marlene, Triangle is often compared to Hitchcock's film Rope. What exactly is the comparison, do you think?
Well, I think there are a few ways that we can compare it. And one comment, I can't take credit for this because I actually heard it on our podcast friend, Brandon Shamatala's Hitchcock podcast. Good Evening, an Alfred Hitchcock podcast, which is well worth checking out for any of our listeners that have not done so, if they're interested in this. But when they discussed Rope, they said that a viewer can watch Rope for the story or for the technique. So I really started thinking about that based on my viewings of Rope in the past and of Triangle. And I think that that's it's a similar situation for Triangle, except I would say that the technique stands out more in Triangle. And I don't necessarily mean that in a good way, but I think that there's content, nor in a bad way. To me, it's more of a mixed bag. But I think that Chris Carter, Triangle is kind of a combination of a lot of different threads, right? So it has Rope, it has The Wizard of Oz, it has, introduces a little bit more of a time travel aspect of it as well. Although both of those, The Wizard of Oz and Rope both have these kind of temporal components to them. But I think he said that he had this kind of specific intent of filming with a few very long takes and, very few cuts to the film. I feel like in both of them, and I say I feel because I really do feel like when I'm watching them, the time is extended, and I think I had mentioned to you that there's something about watching Rope that depresses me. I was wondering about that. And it's not just, the content is pretty, creepy, but it's not that. It's just the way that this event, it's a dinner party, basically. It takes place over the course of an evening in these very long shots. And so you're just kind of following the characters, through this apartment. And basically in this one room. And I think part of the feeling of the suspense, it feels like the evening to me seems like it's going to last forever. Like this is not going to end. But at the same time, part of the suspense is whether or not the guests at the party are going to figure out that there's a body in the trunk on which they're serving the dinner. But I think that the other one is these extended cuts of the activity in the room. And it just changes you have this time in the apartment seems like it's not going to end, but then you have this panorama of night or evening turning to night outside that's visible outside this panoramic window. So it seems like there's just this anxiety that's building just from the incongruence of time and my experience. So it seems like it's moving forward in one way, but it's kind of staying the same inside. And it just, you get more and more nervous, or I do as a viewer watching this. And so I think that in that way, Hitchcock's style, a couple of the cuts that he does use are a little bit obvious, but I think it works throughout the whole movie just because of the way the time is structured. Whereas in Triangle, it's explicitly manipulating this perception of time with the juxtaposition between, Mulder's on the Queen Anne in 1939, and then there's the present day FBI building. And so I think that in Triangle, some scenes work better than others. Like Scully's moving through the FBI building, and going onto the elevator and out in the parking garage, all of that I think is really effective because, all these long takes kind of make the scene seem longer, and it shows Scully's building anxiety and the feeling that this, she's not going to get what she's looking for, but it's just the anxiety and the pacing works well. But I also think that the earlier scenes on the boat are not that useful with the long cuts. It's just, I don't know. I always find it boring. It's just this perception of time that's kind of slow and slogging. And maybe that is showing something about Mulder's experience, but to me, it's the scenes that are a little bit, quicker paced, like Mulder and Scully running through the hallway at the end. It's almost like they're in a fun house, and then they switch over, Scully switches over and has a time crossover. And I think all of that is very effectively done with these long takes. But I don't know. I think the time effect in Rope had to be consistent to build that sense of dread and tension and suspense. But I think that the technique in Triangle made me focus more on the technique than on the story. Whereas if Chris Carter had used it more selectively and maybe had some quicker cuts, in parts of the story that were slower, I think that would have worked better. I mean, I know that sounds more like a critique of the episode than a comparison, but I guess I noticed, I think that that's what he was trying to do. I think some parts worked really well and some, and extending time, and some parts took me a little bit more out of the story. Whereas Rope, I feel like I'm in that room the whole time.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think I've got a quote of Hitchcock's here where he says, "I undertook Rope as a stunt. That's the only way I can describe it. I really don't know how I came to indulge in it." But I really think he sells himself short with that quote, because I think what he does with his technique in Rope is he finds another way to reinforce his control over the film, which he would typically do through editing, I think, in a lot of other cases. But here it's long takes. It doesn't quite play out in the way a lot of people say it does. It's often described as being a film that plays out as one apparently unbroken shot, with the disguised editing. I was watching it yesterday. That's not actually true. There are a few traditional edits in there, including from the first shot to the second, where you go from outside to in. But even later, there are a couple. But these disguised shots where the camera moves into a character's back or something.
Right. Or I think there's one with the door maybe swinging where they're able to cut.
Now, the idea of using long takes, I think on the face of it, you would think maybe that gives the viewer a bit more control, because, we can focus on anything that's in the frame. The editing doesn't direct our attention or distract us. But that doesn't really accord with what happens in Rope, I don't think, because Hitchcock proves just as adept at doing things like, creating these juxtapositions without having to cut from one thing to the other. So I think some people have described it as being like a filmed play.
Mm-hmm. And I think, did Jimmy Stewart say that the camera almost was more important than the actors? Like that was the thing that was a concern to him in filming, was that more emphasis was on this, like the camera being the sort of following, device or whatever, rather than focusing on necessarily on the actors and the characters.
That sounds possible, but I would argue that it isn't a quote unquote filmed play, because what's interesting about it is we're only ever shown what Hitchcock wants us to see. Mm-hmm. And the way that he does that, I think, is very effective. Now, with Triangle, I think the stunt description is much more accurate. Now, there's nothing wrong with stunts. I've been to stunt shows, I quite like the idea. But I never lose sight of the gimmick in Triangle. I don't know about you, but it seems to me, to an extent in Triangle, like the characters are written in a way to service that gimmick. Yes. Rather than the visual style being built around the characters, which is not necessarily a problem. I think there can be some value to that. I think it's understandable for a series that's been on the air for several years to want to do some experiments. I don't know if this is fair. Does it point to the fact then that the comparison with Rope overall is quite a superficial one once you get beyond that surface kind of connection?
I think it is, at least halfway. Because again, I think some of the scenes but I think, I would say yes, because I think the scenes that worked well in Triangle using the longer technique were scenes that were completely incongruent with the pacing and, the nature of Rope. So it's again like those fast-paced scenes where Scully is moving from location to location to location, and the same thing in the FBI building, and then the same thing toward the end of the episode when Mulder and Scully are running through the hallways. I think all of that works well, but none of that is in any way similar to Rope. Whereas the scenes when they, either or both of them are in the same location and we have these long scenes, that's then the content, or at least the setting, is a little more similar to what we see in Rope. But I don't think that the filming works as well. I think it is more of I wouldn't necessarily say like a gimmick, but kind of like, I don't know, a trick of some sort, Yeah. And to your point about the characters, I do think that they were sort of molded around using that in the story to a degree, molded around using that technique rather than the technique serving the story. And it seems that in both of the situations in Triangle, so both the present day situation in the FBI and then the situation on the Queen Anne in 1939, Scully they're almost character types. Like she's kind of this World War II character type in both of those, which I think is interesting for her character, but I don't think that it's necessarily, presenting Scully in a compelling way. It's just sort of, it's a little cartoonish, I think.
So are you talking about moments like when she kisses Skinner?
Yes.
That kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So her frustration when she's walking down the hall and just getting flustered really easily. And then also, the moment when she is so thankful and she throws herself at Skinner and kisses him. All of that is, it's amusing and entertaining, I guess. But it is sort of that dramatic, World War II, a certain type of woman character, I guess,
Yeah.
rather than actually being in character as Scully or showing some sort of plight of Scully's that has more to do with human nature, which I think would be more of a Hitchcock thing to do.
Yeah, because I think in Rope, I think that it's interesting that you talk about being kind of unsettled by the film, because I think it is quite claustrophobic, and I think that works because one of the things that's going on is James Stewart, who's kind of this mentor figure to one of the murderers. They have this discussion about the morality of murder, and it seems like Stewart's moral position evolves towards the end of the film. And I think the sort of form the film takes kind of helps make that work.
And it's philosophy and reality as well. And I don't think that he saw the implications of his, what was his previous, or the start of the evening, his philosophy until the end. Yeah. And so having it be this drawn out realization, I think does work. Yeah.
Now if I could, far be it from me to, tell Alfred Hitchcock what he should have done, but I think those moments in Rope where you go to somebody's back and it disguises a cut, I think actually those are quite a little bit distracting. Whereas I think the bulk of the film is generally unobtrusive, apart from those few moments. Now, the difference then with Triangle, I think it's quite hard to watch it and forget about Chris Carter's presence behind the camera, if that makes sense. So the fact that the camera is so much more mobile and the characters, as we've said.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. And it's like you say, it's quite a weird brew, isn't it? All the different things at play in Triangle. I think maybe that's one of the reasons it's quite appealing. And I know a lot of fans do consider it one of their favourite episodes, But you've got this kind of Hitchcock technical conceit. You've got this more contemporary style with the long camera marches, which remind me of something more from like a De Palma film or something like Goodfellas, for instance. Also, the Wizard of Oz, like you're saying, is quite pulpy sheen to some of the dialogue, and Scully's got this she's almost got kind of a screwball energy.
Yes.
To the way she acts in the FBI.
Kind of brash screwball.
Yeah.
Late 1930s, 1940s sort of character.
Now, so Carter's odd episodes, like the Triangle, Postmodern Prometheus, those kinds of experiments, they don't always resonate with me like they do for a lot of fans, but there's something about and we're probably getting away from Hitchcock a little bit, but there's something about the convergence of those ostensibly quite disparate elements, which is kind of interesting. Maybe it kind of reflects the way he thinks or something. I don't know. I
think it does. I mean, I think he's extraordinarily creative, but I think sometimes, with creativity, if you're making a product and it's for, mass or market consumption, there's a degree to which you can associate that has just the right amount of connection between two or more ideas that seemed unrelated, but you put them together in a way and people have an aha moment, this does click and it goes together and you're absorbed by it. And if there's not enough of that, then it's just kind of mundane or something you've seen before. Not necessarily bad, but it's not creative. If you go too far beyond that, it's a little bit more chaotic. The association exists more in his mind, but he's not been able to have, it's the tension between the ordinary and then something that is just so singular that it's not going to make a connection for anyone else. And I think that he tends sometimes to, a lot of people have talked about this, to kind of put so many ideas, and maybe he sees how they're related. And I can kind of see if I think about it really hard. But if you're watching a show, an episode of something, to sit and analyze and put together how this might psychologically be connected to him, that takes me out of the episode. It's fun in its own regard, I suppose. But I think there's sometimes, with his works of this sort, there's so many things put into it that, it's losing that sort of that snap of your attention that really pulls you into the story.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you read a book of poetry and you need the footnotes which tell you that a particular line is a reference to what the poet had for breakfast that morning. And you think, well, I wouldn't know that unless I had this edition that was written 200 years later. I think we need those crib notes for Chris Carter sometimes. Do you see any... Triangle, I think, is the obvious example in terms of Carter and Hitchcock. Do you see, echoes of Hitchcock in other Chris Carter scripts or episodes? What do you think?
I'm sure that there would be. Do you think of any? Because I'm not coming up with it from his particular, written episodes offhand.
Nothing as obvious as Triangle and Rope. I did wonder in the case of Irresistible, if we could say somebody like Donnie Pfaster is kind of in that lineage of Norman Bates. How directly, I don't know, but...
Yeah.
Because the episode works to establish the sense of Donnie as a boy next door type in certain ways.
Right.
I think as the episode gets towards its climax, that connection to Psycho becomes a bit more evident. He goes to his mother's house, doesn't he, at one point, I think?
Right.
I've always felt Irresistible, just as a side note. I think there's kind of a tension there because I think Nick Chinland's performance, as memorable as it is, it kind of undercuts what the script says about him being this boy next door figure, because it's quite hard for me to believe that this man would live his life without setting off all these alarm bells.
He's super creepy. I mean,
well, that's the thing. In Psycho, Anthony Perkins is creepy, but he also captures that sense of ordinariness very well, I think.
Well, so here's the thing that just occurred to me. I saw Irresistible before I saw Psycho. So, and I mean, I think there are parallels that have been done in cinema and in TV before with the, again, like you said, like the boy next door type that's a little bit overly attached to his mother. Conversation comes about his mother. He's, lives in this, or not lives, but he like goes to this creepy house that his mother owned. He has a fascination with dead things. I think that's a, connection as well. And, both he and Norman Bates had jobs that were methods of access basically to their victims. But I had the idea of Donnie Pfaster in my head, and I think, like you said, he's kind of part of the lineage. I don't think it could be a direct, who knows where it came from, but Psycho is sort of the, the paradigm, I guess, of that kind of character. But when I saw Psycho, and I knew the story because it's just, something that most people, whether or not you've seen all of the film, know, I was surprised then by how normal and kind of quirkily appealing Norman Bates was, because I had in my head this idea that was going to be closer to Donnie Pfaster. And so that to me was a little alarming, seeing Psycho and that he's just so affable. Like if I had, if you had the two side by side, I would definitely be far more comfortable with Norman at first than with Donnie Pfaster. So I think that is a good point. It's just, to me, the point is that, and seeing them in reverse changed my perception of Norman, or like surprised me at his perception. And then I could look back and say like that it was almost, that's why I find Irresistible has this like unintentional comedy. And I think that it is that, everybody is saying that he's normal. I'm like, no, he's really creepy. His behavior is not normal.
Yeah, I would venture the word campiness.
Right. I think. That's what I would say too.
There's nothing wrong with camp. I think camp can be interesting, but
sure.
I don't always see that episode in the same way as... I think it's a very good episode, don't get me wrong. I don't find myself terrified.
That's what I was going to say. I don't find it terrifying. I find it compelling for some of the, the reasons of Scully's story, but I don't find it terrifying at all. And I don't know that there was to be a parallel between Scully and, like Marion Crane and Psycho necessarily. I don't think that there is at all. I don't think it was intended, either. I think it's just that veneer of the, the sort of supposed to be seemingly normal boy that's a little, or boy, he's a man, but like as a boy was a little attached to his mother. That's probably that's the only lineage that I can see, the only relationship I can see.
Yeah, that's what I think too. Okay, so Hitchcock was somebody who was in addition to being such a great figure artistically, but somebody notable for his on-screen persona. He had these cameo appearances. Mm-hmm. He had his television series where he would introduce the episodes and directed some of them. He would appear in the trailers for things like Psycho and The Birds. So is there a comparison to be made between him and Chris Carter, who also made cameos in The X-Files from time to time, didn't he? Mm-hmm. Was also a public figure, of course, who would give these interviews. And arguably his interviews shaped the reception of the series and how fans interpret it to some extent, whether rightly or wrongly. And as we record, actually, this is kind of timely because Chris Carter, he's given a podcast interview to a Danish X-Files podcast, and it's spawned a few follow-up articles and things about what he said about season 11. But yeah, do you see any echoes of, or any comparison with Hitchcock and Chris Carter as an on-screen or as a public persona?
Well, I assume that is, that the comparison to Hitchcock is why Chris Carter is in some of the X-Files. So like you had mentioned, Anasazi, he's in Hollywood AD, he's in the hallway scene and I Want to Believe. And I think that one is the most Hitchcockian of the appearances because it is just in passing, which is something that would have, Hitchcock wasn't a big presence in his movies. Sometimes you had to kind of like look for him somewhere. Like I think in Rope, is he on a billboard outside? It's something like that. It's something that's a little bit more,
it's something like that.
Difficult to see. And I think that those in general are just fun. I feel like Hitchcock's are more fun, whereas Chris Carter's are more, I like them, but I think it's, It doesn't have that same kind of impish spirit that Hitchcock's did, but I assume that's why he did it, just as a, you know, a fun kind of thing to do. As far as the interviews go, I think it's going to be really interesting to see in the future if there's a codified reception of the show in the future that's shaped more by what he had to say about it. I feel like it's still early to tell at this point. I do think some of the earlier statements that he had made about just the nature of the X-Files and creating it, you know, about like discovering things in the story rather than having a specified show plan. I think those are sort of the most likely to have influenced the overall perception of the show, that that's the type of show it was, where you're going to come across something new, you know, and it may or may not work, but it's not going to be where you have this, you know, spelled out plan the whole way through. So I think that's been the most influential thing that he said. Again, like Hitchcock talked more about human nature in his interviews and like what he wanted to show through the characters than Chris Carter does, I think. But again, I mean, I think that if Chris Carter sticks around and has more to say in the future about the X-Files, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if there's another perspective, you know, like 20 years from now, let's say.
Yeah.
Let's see. So as far as like filming introductions to episodes, you know, Chris Carter has done that for some of the various like DVD releases and Blu-ray releases and then just like special, I guess, features and so forth. And I like them. I think he does a nice job introducing them, but there's just not that same style of showmanship as Hitchcock. I feel like Chris Carter is more cerebral, whereas Hitchcock is more, again, like that sort of playing to the audience and what he can draw out of the audience. And it also seems to me, I'm curious what you think of this. I feel like Chris Carter creates more uncertainty around the show, not necessarily suspense, but it's like a wait and see, whereas Hitchcock sort of introduced elements that would create suspense or concern, you know, like in The Birds or with Psycho when he talks about all the blood and the stairs and the sorts of things. So he's like showing you a little bit of what's to come. And I think that's really different than the way that Chris Carter talks. What do you think about that, though?
Yeah, well, just as context, so the trailer to Psycho is it's like a 6-minute tour of the set. I think they actually filmed it on the last day of shooting, where Hitchcock kind of flags up some of the things that are to come, whilst preserving the surprise in other areas, like the surprise about Mother is kind of held back in the trailer. So I think it was actually quite well thought out. Now with Chris Carter, I think his interviews about the X-Files, I'm talking generally, I haven't done like a really close study of this, but haven't they always been characterized by this kind of teasing tendency, you know, being vague, being evasive about whatever, the significance of certain things? Now, I think when the show was at its height, that didn't seem to be a problem. You know, and he would do like web chats with fans or whatever. It seemed to work well. Now, I think most people gave him the benefit of the doubt that he knew what he was doing, knew what the payoff to all these things would be. And I think it just seems like as time went on, I'm not sure how much he changed, but it seemed like the conventional wisdom around him seemed to shift. So where he had been given the benefit of the doubt, it seemed like most people moved to a position of thinking, well, he's just making it up as he goes along. And I think as more and more controversial things on the show happened, I think most notably with season 11, episode 1, I think the discussion by fans it seemed increasingly overtly hostile, didn't it, about Carter? I don't know. I think that is he a fixed pointer? It seemed like he never changed that dramatically, but expectations of what he should be saying maybe changed. I don't know.
I think too, the X-Files is him not changing is, I don't know. As you were saying, like for the earlier parts of the series, that made sense. But it's an open-ended story, and apparently it's always going to be open-ended, you know? So I think him not changing is problematic in that regard. Not problematic, but it's not ideal in that regard, you know, because it's just going to keep going and going and going. And so he's, you know, apparently always going to be talking about an open-ended story, whereas Hitchcock, you know, I mean, to be fair to Chris Carter, Hitchcock, when he's filming, you know, the trailer for Psycho, like it's a closed story. The movie's in the can. And he's masterful at bringing out these elements that are going to create this kind of fun, intrigue, and suspense. But he's also talking about a closed story. Now, it is on Chris Carter's shoulders that the X-Files is not a closed story, or there wasn't, whatever the ending is that he has in mind, he didn't, you know, I guess do that. And then if more episodes were to come, like just move into some other story is what I would, but no, I mean, nobody really knows, I guess, like what his intent was. But I think that the open-endedness of that and the fact that he let it keep becoming open-ended and going on and, you know, and not changing in his sort of style of presentation, I think I mean, I think that's it's different in that he didn't change into, talking about a story in the past. And I guess that's why I wonder, like, in the future, if it ever is like that was the story, that's it, how he'll discuss it differently.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I think, as you kind of allude to, I think they do come from quite different traditions, actually. So, let's say with something like a book, we understand that the author of a book is somebody who originated that text. I mean, that might not always be 100% the case. There are editors, they might have, bounced their ideas off other people or whatever. Mm-hmm. But we sort of take that feeling. When it comes to film, I think that, we attribute authorship to the director at the same time as we understand, well, it's highly collaborative, loads of people are involved. But I think we think of the director, or somebody like Hitchcock as a director, as somebody who's there and is responsible for the film. Mm-hmm. They chose to include these things, whether or not they execute the elements themselves. Again, there are times that's not always valid, especially with a system like the Hollywood studio system. But that's the general idea. And then with somebody like Carter, it's different, isn't it? Because do we see a television showrunner as more of a managerial presence? Because we know that TV series are made in this quite complicated way, that they're working on different episodes at the same time, that kind of thing. Do we sort of see it as a system where there's this team of creative people, they have their own level of autonomy to a greater or lesser extent, and then you have somebody at the top who kind of exercises oversight and is generally a writer in TV shows. And in this case, it would be Chris Carter. So he's kind of an interesting case, isn't he? Because I think he fits the managerial oversight mold, because he's delegating to people like Darren Morgan or Vince Gilligan or whoever, who have their own strong presence in their own right. At the same time, he's got his own creative vision, and he's also, at its most extreme, doing episodes like Postmodern Prometheus, Triangle, Babylon, that represent more straightforward, autorial episodes in the way that you would think of a film director. So I'm not sure whether that those more autorial episodes from him are his strongest hand or not. I'm not sure. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't know that they are the strongest for the show. I mean, they certainly couldn't prop up the show on their own, but I think that there's a segment of the episodes, a small segment of his episodes that is kind of autorial rather than managerial, I guess. He's not necessarily managing a team and making sure things fit this general vision. That's his kind of pure vision. Postmodern Prometheus, Triangle, I would include Improbable.
Yeah.
And, Babylon, I would say. If I had to pick the ones, I would say that's kind of the set that it borrows heavily.
How to Go Stole Christmas, maybe?
I think I would include that too. I don't know why I forgot that one. Maybe I don't know. Maybe the sort of the philosophical vision isn't quite, maybe I'm not thinking along those lines, but I would put that one in there. So yeah, that little set of episodes borrows, from other films and borrows visuals and so forth. But I feel like he is the complete author of what's going on in the episodes. And not just that he's doing the job of the writing and the job of the directing, because I think did he write Dwayne Barry as well as direct it?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. But I don't see something like that being him being an auteur, because that's part of the ongoing storyline. And so even though that was his first directing effort, and maybe he had more, say over the authorship of the storyline in that regard, something like that is part of just him doing the work. Whereas I would say these other episodes that we're talking about are more his vision. I also would argue that he could claim him as an auteur of I Want to Believe had he had more films under his belt of that kind, because I think that was a complete vision. So I would say yes, but in limited scope, he's an auteur. But overall, he probably does have to just be the the manager of more of the show, just because of the nature of TV, and I don't know that he could pull something like that off more frequently than he did with those sorts of episodes.
It's an interesting question whether you need a whole bunch of films, though, isn't it? Because I think the extreme example is Charles Laughton, who directed The Night of the Hunter, and then that was the only film he ever made. A lot of people think it was a classic,
Yeah.
So I think, I Want to Believe, Marlene, I know you love that film.
I do.
I think you can make the case for Carter the author off that.
Yeah.
He came along at an interesting time, I think, because historically, television writers and producers were relatively unknown figures. Think of some of the great series of the 1950s, for instance. I'm not sure many people thought about who the executive producer was. They might have occasionally given the odd interview here and there, but I think it was quite limited. And then now, and from the 80s onwards, I guess, they became much more public figures. And I think somebody like Hitchcock, had he been around and had he got into television rather than film, if he came along later, I think he would have been quite canny at doing things like DVD bonus features, audio commentaries, official podcasts, fan conventions, that kind of thing. I think he probably would have adapted to those things quite in an interesting way. I think with Carter, his guardedness actually works against him to some extent, But then, I don't know, you get some people who are able to make that work, but I'm not sure he fully has.
I think when he has said things, when he really kind of talks, and it's still, again, like more, cerebral, but when he talks openly about something rather than in a kind of cagey way, or being funny, because he can be very witty with his answers sometimes, I think that there's a lot to what he says and a lot of insight, but I think that that's kind of a rarity in his conversations. And he's, in that regard, kind of a man of few words, few words in terms of something that's just kind of open and insightful without trying to, be a tease or be funny or whatever, But I think it's because he is kind of guarded in what he's saying most of the time. So I don't know that lends itself to, kind of a continued relationship with an ongoing audience.
I suppose the thing with Hitchcock is that the things he would say, I think we can see how they kind of shape the way people think about the films with something like Psycho. And what Hitchcock would say in interviews is, you never see the knife in the shower scene. You never see the knife go into the body. That's actually not accurate. You can see the knife penetrate the flesh in like 3 or 4 frames of Psycho. I've done a podcast series, as you know, Marlene, of 8 episodes on Psycho earlier this year for the Movie Palace. And I actually watched the shower scene like frame by frame, and you can see the knife go into the flesh. But I think that the fact that Hitchcock would tell this story and it kind of spoke to a broader truth, which is that the scene is about what it suggests rather than what it explicitly shows.
I know this is not the point. You see it glance past her stomach. Do you actually see it go in?
You see, I think there are 4 frames where you see, and now Darren Mooney said to me that the way it was achieved was that they sort of did it in reverse.
They
started
the shot.
Yeah. So you can't see it sort of plunging, but I think you can see the knife make contact, which is the opposite of what is often said, that it doesn't make contact.
I would disagree, but we'd have to rewatch very detailed.
Well, this is because there's a book on the Psycho shower scene. It was Philip J. Skerry, and he wrote about how he would show the scene to people, and he would slow it down frame by frame, and he pointed out where the knife goes in, and he would be sat next to people who say, no, it doesn't.
I think that's interesting. But it's it's not just perception in terms of like the idea that you're promoting, but it's an actual whether you see something or not, phenomenon. Yeah. So are you wondering if Chris Carter would have that same effect if he were to make that sort of suggestion?
My point is that with Hitchcock, there are a range of things. So he would tell his story about how his father locked him up in a police cell, and he would sort of spin this story out, and it would, people would reiterate the story in interviews, in reviews, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it sort of impacted the way the work was discussed. And I think because Chris Carter's quite enigmatic, I'm not sure what he's had to say over the years, always guides reception in such a constructive way. Yeah. And I think sometimes it backfires on him. I think we saw that with season 11.
So there was one event that I went to in 2011, and you may have seen a DVD of this. It was... The most of it was a conversation with David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson, and then Chris Carter joined them at the end. And at some point toward the end, David Duchovny had to leave. He had some other engagement. So it was Gillian Anderson and Chris Carter. And I don't remember what the audience question was, but Chris Carter told a story about his father he had done something bad, and his father made him go out into the street and eat with his dinner and eat sitting on a manhole cover in the middle of a busy street. And he's telling this story, and it was kind of a serious story, and Gillian Anderson was a little bit shocked that he was telling this story. And then he said something about, so you wonder where the X-Files came from. And it reminded me of the Hitchcock story of being put in jail. Yeah. So there's, maybe some psychological connection there.
That's really fascinating. I'd like to hear the whole story. Okay, what about Hitchcock references in some of these other episodes? And I think, as you may have mentioned, I think Glenn Morgan and or James Wong episodes are quite, interesting case studies here. I think there are a few we can point to. Now, what was that you were saying before? Because I think, in general, I think they're very good at using cinematic references to kind of, like you say, underpin the work without necessarily overwhelming it.
Right.
So not necessarily a Hitchcock connection, but Ice, I think, is a good example of that. What were the episodes you were thinking where it seems a bit more egregious? Like, I suppose there are times like Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man where it's kind of different, but I think there it's kind of for a point. But
well, I don't know if it's ever egregious, because I mean, maybe that's just because I enjoy it, but I think there's some times where it's a little more obvious, it's not maybe as fluid with the episode. Because I think of, like, we talked about Never Again and Followers having visual homages. And then also this is another one. So, like, Never Again basically has that sort of suspense of, you don't know what's going to happen to Scully, given that we know what Ed Durst did to his neighbor, the woman.
Yep.
And it's similar to Hitchcock's Frenzy in that, like, the audience knows the killer before, some of his victims, or before the people that are kind of investigating the crimes and so forth. And it's also that kind of pull away shot, though. And I don't think that you have it's when they're playing the Partridge Family song. Mm-hmm. And the woman is, Ed Durst goes down to the woman's apartment, and he goes in, and that he's killing her, but the camera kind of pans backwards away from it, and you don't see anything. And Frenzy has a similar shot, I believe, going down a staircase where there's a murder happening inside. A man is murdering a woman, and the camera just kind of, like, walks itself backwards down the staircase. I don't think that you necessarily have to, know that connection to be affected by those things for that episode. So I would say something like that is more natural. And then the one in this that I was thinking about that's more of a visual connection is the connection to Psycho, with kind of the use of negative space. So in Psycho, in the shower scene, I believe it's a cut with Marion Crane, Janet Leigh's character, facing the shower head on the right, and she's, on the right side of the frame from, like, what we're watching. Yeah. And then there's this entire negative space of this kind of translucent shower curtain to her left. And so it's one of those, like, in the back of your mind, you're wondering, like, why is there all of this space? And it's not that the space is in front of her, which would be natural in a shot, to have more space, like, in front of the character's perspective. It's, like, all the way on the backside. And so then the next time you see it is when the killer comes in the bathroom and fills the negative space. But it's been that opening to kind of create that little subconscious suspense. And in this, they have the same sort of thing when they're in the classroom scene, when Mulder and Scully are talking to the professor, and they kind of glance back, the camera glances back behind them and shows the sort of translucent glass, the wall, I guess, up at the top of the classroom, and there's nothing there. And then the next time you see movement, and it's the would-be assassin that's coming by there. And I thought that was it's visually compelling. It makes you uneasy, and you don't necessarily know why, but I thought it was a good visual homage to Psycho. The rest of this, I think, is designed, Glenn Morgan has talked about how it's designed as an homage to North by Northwest. Like, Mulder and Scully are on the run to, basically decipher Langley's message. And that's kind of the driving force of the story. And I really enjoyed that episode, but I don't think you can get away from it being that sort of episode based on it coming from the influence of North by Northwest. So to me, it's still fun and I enjoy it, but I don't think it's as organic, maybe. I don't know. What do you think about that?
It's funny because I know Glenn Morgan, I think has specifically referenced North by Northwest, hasn't he, when he was promoting the episode. But the one that sprang to mind for me with that episode was the 39 Steps, because in the 39 Steps, Robert Donat and Madeleine Carroll end up handcuffed together, as Mulder and Scully do in this. That was one I watched a bit of that episode earlier, and I've kind of feeling they get out of that situation a bit too easily, actually. Yeah. They just turn up in the wood and Skinner drives up.
That's interesting, because I was thinking about the steps in there as a visual, like the stairs as a visual, Hitchcock visual too.
Well, no, I think you're right. I think it definitely takes the rough form of one of Hitchcock's falsely accused man stories. So where the hero, or the heroes in this case, they're pursued by the authorities whilst pursuing the real antagonists. So we get daily services after Mulder and Scully whilst they're trying to suss out what's going on with Langley's message.
Right.
I think that what Hitchcock often did with those kind of stories was, although the main characters were innocent of the crime in question, on another level they were guilty of something else. So in Strange on the Train, for example, the character wanted or had this desire for the crime to be committed. In North by Northwest, Cary Grant's this very kind of superficial figure with quite a big ego.
Big ego drinking, right.
Yeah, and that's all kind of stripped away from him as the chase kind of ensues. So I don't know if that level was there with this, although, as you say, I think it's a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but I would say too, like, thinking back to something like Psycho, you know, it's Marion Crane is guilty. She's stolen money from her employer, which it adds that other like layer to like the guilt of the person that's escaping that then leads into this situation where she ends up just being senselessly murdered. You know, there are these layers of complication in human nature going on, whereas I don't see that type of thing with most of the uses in the X-Files, I guess. And particularly like to your point in this, you know, there's nothing that Mulder and Scully, I mean, they certainly have baggage, but in this particular episode, they're sort of, you know, purely innocent, I would say, on the run. And I still think it's a lot of fun. Another thing I was thinking too is that, you know, Hitchcock has a lot of, movies that have a MacGuffin. So something, I guess, that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like some sort of plot device, like a device in the film, a thing that drives the plot, but it's essentially unimportant in the end. So it's moving the characters forward, but then there's no real purpose to it. Would you say that's a fair?
Yeah, something that everybody treats as important, whereas the audience are not bothered by it, kind of see it as unimportant. Yeah. I think we get MacGuffins in the X. I think Tempus Fugit Max with whatever that thing. Would that be a MacGuffin? You think?
I think that would, and I think I was also thinking that the diplomatic pouch in Tunguska and Terma, to a degree, is a MacGuffin. Like that's the focus, you know, in Congress as well. In the committee hearing, they're all talking about the diplomatic pouch, and it's valuable, but it's not necessarily like the be all end all of that. You know, it almost becomes a MacGuffin in that way. And I think with this, you know, what was the goal of it was to destroy the server. I mean, I know there was a backup at the end and so forth, but it seems like that was actually the point as well. Whereas if they had done that, where this whole thing is like they're going to go and find the server, you know, once Legally tells them that that's what it is, and then it turns out that it could have been done having that be a MacGuffin, and I think it would have been a little bit more Hitchcockian to do that. That's just an idea I came up with, though. So I don't want to correct the episode because I really do enjoy it, but I feel like it was a little bit too straightforward at that point.
Yeah, perhaps. I just wanted to return quickly to the Frenzy Never Again connection, because that shot in Frenzy is really great, I think. It's very sad. And the retreat into the street, I think it's making a point. I think it's that thin line between order and chaos. And I think that's relevant to a lot of Hitchcock's films. And with Never Again, I think that's an effective camera move away from the door. You know, I think maybe it's a bit ostentatious, but it's in keeping with what the X-Files does, which is quite often suggest things rather than show them.
Right.
And I think that's often dictated by other factors, you know, censorship or budget limitations, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. But it can allow your imagination to fill in the blanks, you know, the same with like the dark look of the series, shadowy aspect. It conceals things like limitations whilst it adds to the impressive atmosphere.
Oh, I agree. And I think that sometimes things, if they're a little bit, not obvious, but like with this, you know, the pull away and Never Again, I feel like somebody that's, you know, new Frenzy or like knew enough about filmmaking, like might make that connection. But then I think it also then can allow you to connect other aspects. Like again, like we know who the killer is in both Frenzy and in Never Again. You know, we as the audience do, whereas the characters aren't really aware of that yet. And also that neither of those people, neither of those killers are people that would be assumed to be killers right off the bat, because Frenzy also has that sort of like the wrong man, you know, aspect to it too, being convicted. Yeah, I think that having something like a visual can draw your attention to other connections. Okay, so what about
followers, which I think you mentioned before? So we get the drones there, which, well, we see them with Mulder, and that moment where there are lots of drones.
Right. And they kind of build like the birds do in The Birds as well, kind of an infestation.
Yeah, well, that's a great scene in The Birds. It's at the school building, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where Melanie's outside, she's smoking a cigarette. We see a few birds, and then there's the shot of her for a long time, and then we cut to it's like a climbing frame, isn't it? And it's full of birds.
More birds.
Yeah, he stays on her face for so long, but it's kind of unbearable, and that cut to the birds is astonishingly effective. It is a nice moment though in Followers, isn't it? I'm not sure it's an interesting sequence because you go back and forth between Mulder and Scully through that whole thing, don't you? So I don't know if you get the sustained build-up like you do in The Birds.
I don't think you get the sustained build-up because the timing is different, like you said, but I think that I mean, there's also the sense of isolation. Like they're becoming and followers, they're isolated throughout, but they're trying to get away from this sort of, infestation of these, in Mulder's house, the little drones, little bird, drones. And then in the birds, they isolate themselves pretty much in this house to get away from these birds that are, like growing and so forth, growing in number, and coming after them. I don't find followers suspenseful or eerie like I do with the birds, and the drones I don't think are, they're chasing after Mulder. I think that's kind of cute, rather than threatening, I guess, at that point with the little ones. But I don't know. I still think it's a good visual.
Yeah, no, I do too. Well, I suppose the question is, we've used the word Hitchcockian a few times, and what does that mean exactly? So, like, do we actually get genuinely, quote unquote, Hitchcockian suspense on the X-Files, whether in an episode like Followers or in other episodes, really? Mm-hmm. So let me give you how Hitchcock defined the difference between suspense and surprise.
Okay.
And then we can talk about it from there. So Hitchcock said, let's suppose there is a bomb underneath this table between us. Nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, boom, there is an explosion. The public is surprised, but prior to the surprise, it has seen an absolutely ordinary scene of no special consequence. Now let us take a suspense situation. The bomb is underneath the table and the public knows it, probably because they have seen the anarchist place it there. The public is aware the bomb is going to explode at 1 o'clock, and there's a clock in the decor. The public conceive it as 1:45. In these conditions, the same innocuous conversation becomes fascinating because the public is participating in the scene. The audience is longing to warn the characters on the screen. You shouldn't be talking about such trivial matters. There's a bomb beneath you and it is about to explode. So he says that, in the first scenario, you get 15 seconds of surprise when the explosion comes. Mm-hmm. In the second, you get 15 minutes of suspense. Whenever possible, the public must be informed. So I think that's what most people point to when they try to define Hitchcockian suspense. But is there more to it than that? How do you see it?
I think that's a great example that he gave. It's of the audience knowing something that the characters don't know. And another quote that I've found of his that kind of goes with that is the mystery is that the spectator knows less than the characters. And then suspense, of course, is like you were reading, if they know more than the characters in the movie. I don't know. It seems like something that is suspenseful would be like if the director or the filmmaker maybe knows when something is going to happen, and the audience only knows that it's going to happen, and then the characters know neither. I was kind of playing with these ideas, thinking about it, just in terms of, because that's going to, I don't know, that's going to like build the suspense of the audience in terms of like being unsettled or uncertain as to like if something is going to be revealed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one with it. I was trying to think about this earlier because I think there's something hard to define about the suspense Hitchcock creates, I think. And I was looking in my Robin Wood Hitchcock book, and he says that sometimes it's Hitchcock's means of making the spectator share the experiences of the characters. Sometimes it's from a tension in the spectator between conflicting responses. And sometimes it's not entirely distinct from a growing discomfort as we are made aware of our own involvement in desires and emotions that are the reverse of admirable. Mm-hmm. So I think it goes beyond what a lot of people think of as being Hitchcockian, because I think Hitchcock suspense usually had an organic thematic purpose. Mm-hmm. So like the scene, let's think of Grace Kelly in Rear Window when she goes over to the apartment across the way, for instance.
Yes.
It's not just the fact that she's in danger and that's, nerve-wracking in and of itself, but it's also the fact that James Stewart's character is so powerless, and to some degree, he's complicit in it. Yep. Yeah. And Cary Grant in North by Northwest, when the crop duster comes for him, it's not just that it's dangerous, it's the fact that, like I say, he's this guy from the city who's this very slick, superficial life, and at that moment, he's completely exposed and vulnerable, and all his kind of...
Right.
Everything's been stripped away from him. So I think there's a difference between sometimes what people think of as being Hitchcockian and the actual kind of intricacy of it, if that makes sense.
Well, I think it's like, I agree entirely. I think that it's something vulnerable in the character, and it could be that they're just out of their element, or like I was thinking of Rear Window as well, because it seems like there's another form of character incapacitation in that. So like lack of knowledge could be one form, which is what you talk about with the bomb. People are having, this conversation unknowing of what's really happening, and the audience knows. So there's that level of suspense of, that they're not going to find out, or like that they need to stop talking, and pay attention, or know that this bomb is there or whatever. But I think that in Rear Window, for example, Jimmy Stewart's character, is physically incapacitated. Yeah. Like you said, he's kind of helpless when Lisa Grace Kelly's character goes over to Thorwald's apartment. And then also that sort of, that ultimate scene when, Raymond Burr, Thorwald is coming up the stairs to get him. And you just hear that gradual clunk of the footsteps coming up the stairs. And we know pretty much what's going to happen, or at least what the intent is. And Jimmy Stewart knows what's about to happen. So there's no lack of knowledge or awareness. It's just that he is stuck in this apartment, in this wheelchair, limited in his response. So that suspense is like how that's going to be handled. But it's a different, I think it's a different form of not knowing something or incapacitation of some sort.
So I was trying to think of a good X-Files episode example with Hitchcockian suspense, and I'd have to look at it more carefully, but I'm thinking that while there are suspenseful episodes and sequences, I'm not sure I would say Hitchcockian in the same way for most of them. But what about as an example, and this is not an episode that would usually be compared to Hitchcock, I don't think, but the suspense that Morgan and Wong generate in Ice, it does serve that organic thematic purpose, though, in that I think the suspense, it marks this kind of pivotal point in the characters' evolution and their relationship in a way that I think makes the whole episode, and I think makes it one that's, worth revisiting. Well, I don't know. What do you think? I'm not sure about that one, though.
I don't know it would be directly Hitchcockian, but I do think there's something to it. And I think a lot of the episodes that are eminently rewatchable have some sort of element of something else that you want to figure out that's not necessarily the story. And with Ice, you have that evolution in Mulder and Scully going from sort of the very early stages of their working relationship through this, like distrust and trust and so forth. But all the other characters have their own things going on too. And I think that there are interesting contrasts with Hodge and De Silva that are apparently a couple, but we don't quite know. But there's just a lot emotionally going on with them. And there's a lot of this discussion of, the temperature, like all of these things that seem to be elements that go into something being like heated or cool and whatnot that would have to do with some human relationship. And you just get the sense that there's some sort of tension. Well, there's tension, but there's some sort of guilt or control or something else that has to do with, something fundamental to human nature maybe gone awry that's going on with them that could be contrasted with Mulder and Scully. So I think that there's this like underlying suspense on who these people are. Not just in the story, but just who they are in general and why they're there, that does have a little bit of a, Hitchcockian, sort of, I guess, like character construction to it. I would say yes to that. I have another one that's on the suspense angle, or that may be an example. It's not a visual reference necessarily, but I think of the tram sequence in Ascension. Yes. And it has the strong visual, it has the kind of the action, but it's action at a slow pace. It's another one of those scenes that just kind of keeps going. And Mulder has to go up to the, the center of the tram line and then down the other side and so forth. And they're changing the speed up and down. So all of that's building suspense. The other thing is that we know Krychek is not who he claims to be, but Mulder doesn't know this yet. So that was the one that I came up with as being, a fairly standard example of something that could be like Hitchcock type suspense.
Yeah, that's a good one. I always think of Moonraker with Ascension.
Oh, right. I remember you talked about
Roger Moore fights Jaws on top of the on the cable car. Moonraker. Okay, let's run through some of these other Hitchcock nods, Marlene, because sometimes there are episodes where there is an explicit nod, even if it's not the main point of the episode at all. So if I throw some episode names at you, perhaps you could outline what you think the connection is.
All right, I'll try. Let's do that.
Mulder and Scully meet the weremonster.
Okay, so this one I think has like very clear and fun, psycho connections. I feel like Mulder and Scully are very clearly staying at the Bates Motel, and the hotel clerk, it's Alex Diakin, so it's not the same as, Anthony Perkins in Psycho, but he's kind of boyish. He's far more awkward than Norman was. He's got the sort of jittery mannerisms. And he's a voyeur. There's a scene, of him looking through. He has the animal heads that are mounted on the walls in the hotel rooms that he can, he can take off, or he can look through those, the eye holes, I guess, in them. So there's very similar. I mean, it's not even similar. It's pretty much a direct, I say rip off, but I mean it in a positive way, of Psycho. I have taxidermy to excess is what I put on there as well. I mean, the like big overhanging birds, all the things in that, hotel room in which we see Scully very clearly come from Psycho.
Yeah.
So that was the major thing that I noticed.
Yeah, don't we also get like a peephole moment that maybe calls to mind Psycho in Red Museum?
Mm-hmm.
With I can't remember the character's name right now, but
yes, I guess that does call to mind Psycho. I think it's a less obvious. Like that's one where you don't necessarily have to say like, oh, this is from Psycho. It could just be a peeping Tom. But I think because that's such a strong, image from Psycho that that would fit as well.
Okay, what about the episode 4D?
Ford. So again, like what I remember from this one, I don't see it often, but I have seen it in the past few years. And so what I remember is basically the killer that sort of crosses dimensions is living with his, overbearing mother that requires care. And I think he kills her, smothers her, I believe. So it seemed fairly sort of standard in that regard. there may be other things in the episode that, harken back to that as well. And that's just a visual reminder. But I thought that was it. Just kind of a nod to Psycho. Yeah.
Yeah. And mothers generally not presented in a very favorable light in Hitchcock films, I think, to a greater or lesser extent, whether it's because they're neurotic or whatever, or they raised a psychopath, or whatever it may be. Okay. What about Terms of Endearment?
Terms of Endearment has the husband presenting his wife with a glass of milk, I believe.
Yep.
Is it Mandrake that's in it? It's basically a drugged glass of milk. And so, he's trying to, I think, induce labor, premature labor. I could be wrong about this.
Yep.
It's like, again, that's another one. It's been a little while since I've seen it. But it's a sinister presentation of this glass of milk, which corresponds to the movie Suspicion, in which the husband that is, we're not quite sure exactly what his intent is, but it seems like it's fairly controlling and nefarious, has a glass of milk and he carries it up the stairs and it's kind of got a glow. It's this glowing glass of milk that's a very, famous image in Hitchcock. So I thought that was well done too, because it's parallel between those two relationships as well as just a good image.
Yeah. So I actually rewatched Suspicion yesterday, and the interesting thing with Suspicion is it kind of has a cop-out ending where all of a sudden Cary Grant is not doing these bad things. He's had a change of heart. He wasn't trying to kill her.
Or you just don't know what he's going to do. He just says that, but it just ends from what I remember from it.
Yeah. Well, Hitchcock has talked about the fact that the ending was kind of imposed on him. And then there are other people who've written about Hitchcock who say that may not be the case, actually. Mm-hmm. I think Terms of Endearment, it also readily calls to mind Rosemary's Baby. I think they talked about wanting it to be Rosemary's Baby in reverse, I think is the phrase.
Okay.
Okay, you mentioned Too Shy, I think.
Yeah, the only thing with that was the thing that called my attention to it was the name of the online group is the Lonely Hearts that the would-be victim belongs to. And then there's a character in Rear Window that, the character of Jeff, Jimmy Stewart's character, he has names for all of his neighbors. He's sitting there and it's a hot day, or not even day, it's a hot summer, I guess. And all he has to do is watch his neighbors. And so, which is a great thing about that movie too, just to kind of like a slight, little cheer to Rear Window, is that the main thing, of course, is that him observing this murder. And that's kind of the famous part. But there's all of the, other little entertainments going on in the building. But one of them is a woman that he calls Miss Lonely Hearts that is, sort of forever pining for Mr. Right to come into her life. And so he's sort of watching her progression throughout the movie, and he, refers to her as Miss Lonely Hearts. And I thought that also, like, that sort of character type fit the character in Too Shy as well. I think that the name is probably the connection, but I think that, there's also a parallel between, like, these kind of good-hearted women that want to, meet a nice man, but maybe not going about it in the wisest way, I suppose. Yeah.
I was wondering with this one because I think there's a novel, isn't there, from the 1930s called Miss Lonely Hearts by Nathaniel West, which I don't know if that's a touchstone as well, but it's a common enough phrase.
Yeah.
The novel's about a man who writes a Miss Lonely Hearts column, and he becomes more and more depressed as he does so.
Okay.
But I don't know. I don't know. Okay. What about season 7's Chimera?
I am still thinking about that. To me, I was thinking the digging in the garden is kind of like, that's a Rear Window connection to me with the dog that's like digging in the place where they think that Thorwald has buried, I think it's the murder weapon, isn't it? The knife that they think he's buried in the garden. So they have this dog that's digging. There's, I'd have to think more about it because it just seems like the symbolism that with the birds, with everything else, has a lot more connections, but it's not one where everything, seems obvious to me right off the bat. What would you say?
Well, I suppose, is it Ellen, the character in Chimera? She's ostensibly a victim, but actually the perpetrator. Mm-hmm. And we leave her hospitalized in that cell, don't we?
Yes.
And Psycho, we leave Norman in the cell.
That's
as
true.
Well. So I don't know, maybe a connection there.
Well, she also had a dual nature, so that kind of goes with that as well.
Yeah, and anything with bird, there's ravens isn't it, in Chimera, but it obviously makes you think of the birds to some extent.
Yeah. I just thought there's a lot of sort of like symbolism and then characters that are like the not guilty but guilty, like the sheriff, for example. I think of that conversation with Mulder at the dining room table when he's sort of like wanting to give him this excuse, and Mulder figures out that he's having these affairs with these women in town. So there's that, kind of guilt of his nature, the type of person he is, even though he was not involved in the murder.
I think that's quite an overlooked episode, Chimera.
I do
think
too.
There's quite a bit to it. Yeah.
That, and in terms of just the storytelling as well, and because it's done in a fun way with Mulder and Scully on the phone, but I think it's actually more creative than we realize sometimes.
I think a few people see it as a bit of a rehash of Arcadia with the suburban kind of thing, but I think it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
Okay, just a couple more then. So in Colony and Endgame, so we have the character Ambrose Chappell, and in Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much, the 50s one, Ambrose Chappell turns out to be, it's kind of a red herring.
Right. But also, didn't they go to the wrong place first? Or they thought it was one thing and it turned out to be the other?
Something
like that. It was some sort of like mistaken location, whereas in Colony and Endgame, Ambrose Chappell is not what he is stating himself to be. And really, Samantha is not quite either. Like, we don't yet know that she's a clone. So I feel like there's that, concealed identity idea there. And then also, like the murder plot, well, there's a kidnapping, I guess, like a ransom situation as well, and a murder plot that's not necessarily like the main plot. So I'm being kind of vague. But in The Man Who Knew Too Much, like in the 56 version, it's the son of the Doris Day and
James Stewart.
Thank you. James Stewart, couldn't remember who it was, that's kidnapped, for these sort of ostensible reasons and so forth. And so they're trying to find him, but there's also this plot, I guess it's the like an ambassador, I think, that's going to be murdered, and someone is, told them that this is going to happen, and that's when their son is kidnapped. So it's this entire plot that's sort of spun on one thing, but turns out to be a little bit of another thing too. And I think that's what Colony and Endgame does. They're both fairly more complicated in plot structure, I guess.
And obviously all the sci-fi trappings and so on. But yeah, that's interesting. I need to rewatch. Okay, the last one I'm curious to hear you talk about, because I know Aubrey is an episode that you're particularly fond of, and it's been a while for me.
Yeah.
And you see a link possibly between this and Hitchcock's Spellbound.
I do, and I think that some of it is just the symbolism of the when Mulder, remember in Aubrey, Mulder notices this triangle and the circle, the Trilondosphere, the perisphere from the World's Fair, that he sees in this photo in Linda Thibodeau's home. And then BJ Morrow has been having dreams that have that symbol in them. And she's having these nightmares and so forth. So the connection then would be to, in my mind, was like when I was thinking about Spellbound. And in that, there's a lot of dream symbolism as well. And there are images that keep sort of showing up in the life of the character. And in both cases, it's this, kind of psychodynamic idea of the past affecting behavior. Mm-hmm. And of course, in Spellbound, it's like his own past in that lifetime, whereas in Aubrey, it's previous lifetimes, I guess, or generations rather, to add that kind of paranormal genetics, I guess, twist to it. But I guess that's what I liked, like the dream symbolism and the past unconsciously affecting behavior, kind of the surreal parts of it. I thought were sort of a little bit of an homage to Spellbound.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that could be, because we think, don't we, that Morgan and Wong, do we think they kind of touched that script up? I think that's what you hear, isn't it?
That's what I've always heard. And I think
they were directly...
Yeah, it does have that feel to it. There's also the very subterranean theme in that episode of things being hidden and unearthed and underground, and whether it's something that's a body buried in the ground or like the indoor swimming pool or memories coming up, that sort of thing, that, you know, I think kind of goes with their storytelling, I guess. And, you know, just, you know, goes to the nature of memory. And like Spellbound was very sort of, you know, psychodynamic as well. So I could see those going together.
Yeah, I need another look at Spellbound, because I think the first time I saw it, and we're talking years ago, but because you have the kind of Salvador Dali sequences there, and I don't know. I think there's probably I've read about it, read things about it subsequently, which say there's more going on in terms of subtext than I think I thought at the time. So I think that's the great thing about Hitchcock, is his films do reward repeat viewings. But yeah, I'll have to fire that one up soon. Okay, Marlene, I think that was all we flagged up. Is that right?
I have a couple. One of them I was going to just mention briefly, and the other one I was going to ask you about. So another one I thought about was Christmas Carol. Because we haven't talked about too many, you know, I mean, that's sort of sidelining into the mythology. But Scully's having these dreams. You know, they start with, you know, the episode sort of starts with Melissa. And there's this focus on Melissa, you know, kind of speaking from the beyond, I guess, as Scully's brother says. And it's driving this case forward that Scully's getting these messages. So that's what starts it. And then it becomes the focus that Melissa might be the mother of this child, of Emily. And I kind of wonder if that's like a sort of MacGuffin, because at the end we figure out that Scully is the real mother, you know, and I think it makes it more surprising because we've had this other thing in our minds the entire time. So there's something about the way that's told through dreams, I think, too, that had a bit of a, you know, a suspenseful, little bit of a Hitchcockian sensibility to it. I might be stretching. I don't know.
No, I don't know. I hadn't thought of it before. Maybe. What was the other one? Okay,
so the other one is a little bit clearer. And this is something that you and Kathy had talked about on the Schizogyny podcast, which was Schizogyny. And I think that there's several things about that are, you know, Psycho related that we haven't really talked about in relation to Psycho yet, that you and Kathy discussed.
Yeah, because I seem to remember thinking that Schizogyny, doesn't it take a while before it starts to layer in these Psycho references? And it's kind of, I don't know, it's an interesting episode, that. I think it's kind of cluttered and stuff, but there's some good stuff in there. Yeah, so just remind me what the connections were.
Oh, right. So I think that, you know, it's the part when we get into the gosh, I can't remember her name. How embarrassing. The therapist that Sarah Jane Redmond.
Oh yeah.
Lisa, is it? No, like Lisa's the girl. Sorry.
Karen?
Karen, yes. Sorry, listeners, for not recalling that. Yeah, when we get into like this Karen, and she seems kind of normal at first. And then there are the parts when she is, they hear her talking, or the girl, Lisa, hears her talking to a man, arguing with a man. And it turns out that it's her, you know, voice. And so she's kind of arguing with her father, sort of inside herself, I guess. So there was that aspect of it that related to Norman, you know, having these arguments with his mother, I think. And then what was the other? There's one when the aunt that was the part about Arbogast that you were talking about with the aunt. And then the one that you didn't mention that I thought about was when they show, there's a shot they have of Karen listening in a therapy session. And she has, I want to say she has like her hand like under her chin or something like that. And she just looks kind of sinister, but it's filmed in a similar way to the shot of Norman Bates at the end of Psycho, when he kind of lifts his head and just the way he's lit from underneath and so forth.
So after Mother has taken over. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
My feeling is that it's very interesting, but I'm not sure it achieves like a thematic, I wouldn't say unity, like it seemed like there's a lot in the mix in that episode, and the Psycho elements were part of that, and maybe it crowded out some proper explanations for other things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's likely. I think the part that does not do that, because I hadn't thought about it until you and Kathy talked about it, was the way that when Lisa is being kept in the basement and she gets her aunt's attention. Yeah. And her aunt comes up to the window. And I think that was the part that you all compared to the detective Arbogast.
Yeah.
And then I guess also that her aunt came and spoke to Karen and was sort of suspicious a little bit about that, which is, you know, kind of similar to Arbogast talking to Norman and being able to piece together that, you know, Norman at first sounds like he's making sense, and then he starts to kind of trip himself up, and Arbogast is noticing that the story is not panning out. So those two things, I think, connect really well to Psycho, but are not, you know, it's not like a, you know, where you're being distracted from the X-Files story because there's this, you know, Psycho reference. The part about the father, That's a little heavy-handed, maybe.
I suppose what's so great in Psycho about Arbogast and just the context of it is that I think the shock of Marion Crane being off, and then you have this kind of transference of identification. So then you're suddenly following Norman, clearing the body up. And then you have these characters introduced like Lila Crane and Arbogast, who are kind of vying for attention with Norman Bates. You know? It's kind of interesting. And a lot of the things like Marion had this kind of recurrent music that would followed her through the first part of the film. And then you don't get these signifiers in the second half of Psycho necessarily. It's kind of Hitchcock playing around with what the audience... I suppose you can identify with more than one thing at one time, but it's very interesting the way the film does it and quite bracing and quite unusual, I think.
It's like, but they're like the new protagonists. Like you said, like it just kind of transfers your, perspective to a different character, which isn't what happens in Schizogyny, but
no.
I don't know if they were trying to go for that at some point with the Karen character, but I don't think they did it.
It's still an underrated episode, I would contend.
Yeah.
And by which I mean that it's much better than people give it credit for.
I agree.
Not necessarily a great episode, but there's valuable stuff there, I think. All right. Marlene, I think we should say to the listeners that if there are any other connections that people think of that we haven't covered, we're happy to hear about that, I guess, on Twitter and Facebook and so on.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a fascinating topic. It's something that, because it is both Hitchcock and the X-Files, have these layers upon layers that you can dig into, but yet they still are entertaining at the same time. There's, always more to pull out. So I would be very curious what other people have seen.
Yeah, same here. Okay, Marlene. So before we go, where can people find you online?
I am on Twitter as Marlene. I think it's Marlene MHS. I'm never quite sure exactly what that is, but Marlene Stemme. And then on Facebook as Marlene Stemme, mostly in the X-Files basement group, discussing these things.
Great stuff. Thank you, Marlene. I am on Twitter at CKJ Sweeney, and actually on my podcast, The Movie Palace, which is predominantly about classic Hollywood cinema, pre-1970, I would say. We've done a few episodes on Hitchcock films before, if you are interested. So like I said earlier, I've done 8 episodes on Hitchcock's Psycho, including one with Marlene and with Tony Black. I've covered other films too. I think I've covered Rear Window, North by Northwest, Shadow of a Doubt, Rebecca, I think I've covered.
Yep.
So there are a few, yeah. So just a bit of cross promotion there before we go. You can find the Xcast in all the usual places, at the X_cast on Twitter, in the Xcast basement on Facebook. But that's all for today, listeners. Until next time, as always, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Pick a disc.
And I bought Riot first, and I was like, oh, I really like this. And then I went back and bought their first album, which I can't think of the name of the first one right now, but I listened to Riot more than I did the first one for sure. Yes, I recently found my old iPod, and you know how it used to, there's a section under settings that would tell you your most listened to songs. This was the top, however many tracks it is, 14 slots. And then it was everything else I listened to.
Right in the childhood.
Robin, the hooded man, do. Mate, before we do anything else, that soundtrack.
Yeah, you're a big fan of it, aren't you? Digging it. I could see the admiration for it in the little twinkle in your eye.
Oh, it twinkle, it put a tear. It's beautiful, beautiful music by a band called Clannad, who obviously played that kind of music generally, and it won a BAFTA.
Oh, okay.
That's because it deserved it.
Yeah. You know what? It definitely fit the aesthetic to the shows.
Cinemortuary podcast.
Yeah, I want to say, and I don't say this lightly, but this might be my favourite 2 minutes of any film we've reviewed on the podcast so far.
Yeah, it's pretty fucking wild. It is pretty wild.
Sure. If I was given the director's chair and $5 million, this is the sort of thing I'd do.
You'd do that for 90 minutes.
Yes.
It's with the roulette wheel
just
again.
non-stop.
What if he vomits playing cards? Beautiful.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the Xcast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, WeMadeThisPod.com, or via Twitter at WeMadeThisPod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.